Fiona, here in your flat in Brighton's Marine Square, we seem very distant from Peru. Yet it is in this flat that you wrote much of your recent book. Tristan Platt comments on the back cover of your book. This is an absorbing account of the long-term origins of Peru's Shining Path movement in the region of Tama. Local visionary Weinrich's suicide in 1908, centralist throttling of municipal and provincial independence, APRA's betrayal, and the sellout to foreign capital all drove radical teachers and civilizers into a dead end. This book, comments Tristan Platt, is a central reading for all interested in Peru and the origins of modern violence. At your book launch in London, you spoke of how long it had taken to write the book. You talked about the challenges of marshalling your arguments and the evidence, but also
it took a very long time for me to find my voice in this material. Where is the person who's trying to bring this together?
Let's talk about that person.
I went to Tama not to look at citizenship and politics. I went there to try and discover market relations. I began to discover that my preconceptions about provincial towns being towns without history, peoples without history, I was completely wrong. To imagine that these towns were ahistorical, that they were always the domains of the property owning class. Marxist way of thinking, and I was heavily involved with a form of Marxism in the early 70s, so that my main interest was looking at capitalism and the rise of capitalism, modes of production very much based in what was happening between feudalism as a mode of production and capitalism. So it had nothing to do really with politics or citizenship.
But you found these archives.
I found the archives. Here was a town that had a history that just blew my mind. The first indication that I would be passionately involved in unearthing this history was the report. On 1st of May, the workers of Tama had progressed around the Plaza de Armas shouting, "Workers of the world unite." And that was that galvanizing moment which I never looked back from, because I could never make as though I hadn't read that report in the newspaper of the time, in the words that were used by the intelligentsia, the radical intelligentsia of that moment, describing an event that for me was unimaginable.
So this is when you first got interested in Adolfo Weinrich, the socialist mayor of Tama at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Then you went back to Tama in 1994, 20 years after your first time there, and 2 years after the capture of Guzman and the decline of the Sendero Luminoso.
It was still in Tarma jumpy. There was a large military base inside the town, and all the roads around had military posts on them. To get to Tarma, you went through I don't know how many military posts. They were still apprehending so-called terrorists. They were still finding cache of arms, particularly in the outer regions of the province. So one of our young, very brilliant young, he had been a master's student and he just finished his master's. This is Henrik Wensbo. And I proposed to Henrik, wouldn't he like to come with me for a few months? So here we have Henrik, who's now based in Mako. And when Mako, it got a license to have its own little transport route. In other words, a microbus. So Henrik thinks it's a great idea that I go along, and for the celebrations of this, a representative of the provincial council turns up, and I had let's say, rather, I kind of assumed it would be a pompous, urban cholo who was going to say some pretty mundane, nice words about the peasants. On the contrary, youngish guy gets up and has the most magnificently performed, involving speech of great power and passion, which was about the peasantry, and was about we were all peasants, and about the future of the peasantry. He was unusually good, and I was quite blown away. And I realised not that long afterwards, I'd heard the first, if you like, encounter with this brilliant verbal discourse that was highly developed by the Maoists. We see them in very categorical and very stereotypical terms. We forget that they were fantastic performers who took theatre to the countryside, who came up and gave rousing speeches, but in a way that was quite electrifying. And it, that was the first kind of intimation that the guy who was now on the provincial council was not just a man from the town, that he was in the embodiment of a Peruvian who had authority, and whose authority came not just from local government, but whose authority came from political movement.
So why is he important?
Carlos, before we left Macon, insisted that I look him up in the municipalidad. He gave me a visiting card and said anything that he could do for me, he'd be very happy to have reality of Peru. And so I took him up on this. He was introducing me to people in a way that I found very sensitive to what I needed. And we then started talking. I then started employing him, in a sense, as a kind of research associate. I'd been invited by a mayor of a displaced community who wanted to go back and who were determined to go back and retake their lands, which they'd been branded collectively as terrorists. The army had come in, the army had been brutal, the army had robbed them of all their belongings, and I was part of that group that went first beyond the military post into that, quotes, no man's land, of retaking by the village, by that community, by the community authorities, retaking their land. It was a very symbolic moment. Carlos gives a speech to the peasantry who had been collected there, and it was all about building a road. But it was a very empowering, it was a very brilliant speech. And we were sitting around afterwards. I paid the beers. As an elderly lady, I could do this. So the wannabe anthropologist was desperate to hear. Carlos just very quickly said, I think we should go. And what transpired, that he had been aware that 3 youngsters had just come up, and they were from a Sendero squad, and he knew exactly. I mean, he was alert to everything that was going on, and for my safety, he took me away, which I then realised, as I say, afterwards. And then on the long journey back, I think there was a kind of bond established of a friendship that transformed from him being a mediator for me to understand a situation. I became far more focused on who the hell he was and what was the role he'd been playing. I began to be aware that many of the people that Carlos was introducing me to as mayors and deputy mayors were actually Senderistas.
A power vacuum had been created by the flight of the traditional political elite. These Senderistas took the opportunity to run local politics.
They were well organised, they were well formulated, they had a tremendously good political upbringing, and some of them had not engaged. I mean, there was a big split, if you like. I mean, an organisational split. There were the ruffians who were the groups who were going round the liquidation squads. But there was a whole mass of ideologues. Now, whereas the liquidation squads were being picked up by the military, ideologues were much more difficult to pin down.
So what happened after the second trip with Carlos?
I decided never to ask about political affiliation, never, because this was dangerous stuff. But he did volunteer that he'd been a member of Pukayaktu. Pukayaktu, Quechua for Red Earth, I think. I knew, because I'd done my homework, had joined in the late 70s with Sendero. So he was giving me little lines which were very cleverly crafted. And so this began, I think, several years. I'd be going back twice a year. And we would continue our discussions.
You were the outsider against which he could actually take a step back from his life,
Yes,
his experience.
and challenge him.
And have you challenged him to help him challenge himself?
Yes. Many of the leftists that I knew had been sympathetic, had joined. That's what it made it so difficult at a certain point, that Guzman takes on the total leadership and exterminates, kills, assassinates people within the party who could challenge him, including this earlier generation of much more sympathetic, you might say, leaders who could have led to a non-violent resolution. Now, I think probably Carlos was in the same position. So here I was in a kind of interlocutory discussion over a long period of time with somebody who had maintained a loyalty to Guzman, apparently, but who represented something very different, which was totally misunderstood or could not. In the polarization that takes place with political violence, there's no room for these characters. They're either killed by one side or the other side. The amazing thing about Carlos was he had survived. Both he'd survived from his own party and he'd been outwitted the police.
So everything that you learned from Carlos is absent from your book, or would you say it's shaping your book?
It's exactly. No, I think it is the shaping, and it made me want to understand the background of somebody I'd come to respect, be very frustrated by, very angry by, but see him in his context. And I got to know his mother very well. She was an indigena in her mid-90s. And I was given the privilege of twice being allowed to take her out for her birthday lunch. Just Carlos, me, and his mother. Now that is something very intimate. I knew a lot about the background. His father, and he'd also taken me to the grave, to the burial place of his father, had been a mestizo. He'd been a union organizer. He'd been a member of the Communist Party, and so from both sides there was this different kinds of politicization.
And this is what your book is really about.
Yes.
One reads a book now and it's like, it's Hamlet without the prince.
No, because I found another prince.
Uh-huh.
And that prince was Adolfo Wienerich.
Right. So you found another prince
who's easier to talk about.
Because it was 100 years earlier.
And he was, he was a galvanizing point, and it made me recognize something about the non-linearity of history. That there had been a period which Carimeños knew about and put into different terms, in which there had been a set of freedoms that they had then lost. And Wienerich encapsulated that. Carlos's second son is named Adolfo, after Wienerich. I mean, a lot of people who came from political families would name their children Adolfo. So this was all alerting me that this movement that had so-called started in 1980. This had a history that it didn't come out of nowhere. And that was partly this aha moment of thinking, I have records of what was happening, and I can tell a story that no Peruvian has ever told before, because it has been unknown that there had been a viable, in some places, a viable local government, and which allowed political debate to take place under a lot of protest, but where else did that was common, but where a radical party based on European socialism, which possibly was doomed anyway, but a radical party had challenged in the public arena the dominance of the provincial council and had won majority seats with Weinrich as mayor on 2 occasions. Didn't last. But this was a history which had both, there's a long history of radicalism. Some kinds of memory had not been lost. And that to understand what had brought very intelligent, very skilled men like Carlos probably into Maoism had been a whole local history that his family had taught him.
So during this whole research period, did your own political perspective change, develop? How was it influenced by your relations with Carlos?
Deeply. And in ways that's taken me, in a sense, a lifetime to understand. Because I think at first there was a huge disjuncture between the feeling of being appalled by any organisation that can preach violence, or that is, not necessarily just preach, but be indifferent to the suffering caused for a greater cause. What I and a load of other people had taken as a kind of mantra in the 70s was that there was this duality between Latin America, reform or revolution. A lot of armchair revolutionaries were preaching this, both in the US and in Europe. It was a very kind of categorical, that revolution was somehow glorious, it was heroic. Changing a very corrupt and US affiliated regime was to make revolution. Che Guevara was an immensely charismatic figure. He was a popular icon. You saw as much of Che Guevara as you did of the Virgin Mary, and you still possibly do. There was this romanticism of revolution. There was a discourse, which I remember in the 70s as being very violent. There were groups who began to say, okay, well, let's put the rhetoric into practice. And that's when you suddenly got this intake of breath and say, how irresponsible to have been preaching revolution is the way to devastation. That there isn't a model from the Soviet Union or from China that actually is a way towards greater social dignity, social justice, whatever your goals could be. That appalling realization, it was a devastating one. And Sendero helped crystallize this. They took stably, put in capital letters, what armchair revolutionaries coming from outside had said, well, this is what you do. You foster a revolution.
And is that what you thought in the 70s?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I was never as belligerent. But I've kind of, without very much deep thought, subscribed that this reform business was really not, that was never going to get it, but a good revolution with wonderful heroic leaders who the masses would flock to was probably the only way to break the stranglehold. You look back and the way that the US had trained and put in power all the military leaders in Latin America, and it caused authoritarianism. There was something to hate about it.
Yeah.
So I can understand that one would say, how can you make reform with these characters? So it was Sendero pushed the armchair radicals, both in Peru but also in the rest of the world, into a position of saying, we don't know. They're doing what we might have suggested was the appropriate strategy. Take a Maoist line. Their Maoist strategy was begin in the countryside, encircle the towns, starve the towns, begin at the tentacles out in the provinces, and so that you, in the end, through your political and armed reaction on actions, will bring down a government. There was this realization that, my God, that was a catastrophe beyond measure.